Hey, Bitcoin wealth builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to episode 68 of Bitcoin Hard Talk. Today, we're going to be discussing everything about Europe and the European Central Bank ECB Euro Proof of Weapons Network, alongside all of the news that happened this week in Bitcoin, in macro, and geopolitics. And I'm going to try and weave in as much of the European Bitcoin macro and economics amongst everything else that is happening all around the world. So if we have not met already, and this is the first time you are tuning in, my name is Simon Dixon. I spent the last 2.5 decades dedicating my life to Bitcoin investing and money. Bitcoin, obviously, the later half. And I go live every week in order to have the hardest talk about the hardest form of money and help you prepare for a world dominated by Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, and central bank digital currencies. And if you did not figure it out by this week, that Bitcoin AI and CBDCs are going to be crucial things that are going to change everything about the world that we function in today, then you need to watch this show. And we're going to jump into the 3 different sections. So the main topic is why Europe must ditch a European central bank and adopt Bitcoin strategic reserves for the individual countries. We're then going to go into some of the different policies around different parts of the region. We had some news from Norway, we had some news from Czech Republic, and we also had some news from Germany, and why they're adopting vastly different Bitcoin strategies and what may be the impact of those as we transition through this macro and geopolitical currency war that we all are experiencing right now. I'm also going to go through the macro impact of Trump's tariffs and oil aspirations and the impact that will have on Europe and the rest of the world. And then finally, in the geopolitical section after the macro section, we're going to go through the impact of China and America's artificial intelligence trade war, where a technology weapon of mass destruction was launched by China this week, and the impact it had on the markets and what it means for the future of artificial intelligence and the trade wars. So without further ado, let's get right in to everything that happened this week in Bitcoin and the European Central Bank news as well. So firstly, in Bitcoin, so we heard from the financial terrorist Christine Lagarde, who is head of the European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank is a proof of weapons network that mainly relies upon the German military industrial complex in order to put forward a Fed first strategy, which is destroying the European economy because it is essentially acting as an America first central bank rather than a European first central bank. And that was, of course, by design. If we look back at the world wars, you know, the German central bank was taken down after World War II, and it was replaced by the Bank of Japan, the Bank of Germany, or the German Central Bank, which was a debt-based monetary proof of weapons network, and also the Italian debt-based monetary system. And for the longest time ever, through Cold Wars and the war on terror, the wars would escalate until the point where we had the fall of the Soviet Union and eventually the rise of the European Central Bank. And the European Central Bank is a member of the Bank for International Settlements, which was an offshoot of the interwar periods between World War I and World War II, when the Bank of England, which was the creator of the proof of weapons network, transitioned to the Fed, being the Federal Reserve, when the European banksters managed to get their third attempt at a central bank into America in order to occupy the US dollar and slowly transition America away from constitutional America to one where the government was deep in debt and a conduit and a tool to the military industrial complex, just like happened in Britain pre-World War I. And the European Central Bank was the final iteration of clustering all these economies together and making them bow down to the European Central Bank and the Fed first policy when you follow the money. Well, anyway, Christine Lagarde came out after her meeting with the Bank for International Settlements. If you saw my X feed, you'll see some of the comical memes. I suggest you go through my feed and check those out. But we had a little quote and she basically said, "I am confident that Bitcoin won't enter into European Union reserves." This is a warning to the countries that want to pursue a sovereign strategy and free themselves from the inflation and cost of living crisis that the European Central Bank has inflicted upon the European people, as they have turned all of the economies into conduits for the banking lobby, the military industrial complex lobby, and the big pharma lobby. And every part of what made those countries diversified has been slowly stripped away. The manufacturing has been stripped away. The nuclear energy has been stripped away. The cheap gas has been stripped away. And it has been, on the recipient end of the euro dollar system, where the euro is guaranteed to suffer greater inflation as it creates massive amounts of dollars in the euro dollar market through the banks and that America first policy that Europe seems to inflict upon itself. And it hasn't quite figured out that that is not working for the European people yet. So there has been a bit of a mega make Europe great again movement arising. And I'd like to share what that actually looks like so that you can prepare for yourself, because the last thing you want to do is sit back and rely upon politicians and those financial, the financial engineering of your central bank, because you have to beat and be one step ahead of the central bank to survive today in the proof of weapons network. So Europe has really been the leader. It was Rishi Sunak who suddenly, after his policy for making absolutely billions of dollars from vaccines, was told by the powers that be in the deep state that he's no longer allowed to play Prime Minister of the UK. But just before then, he made sure that there was a movement towards central bank digital currencies and making sure that the creator of the whole system, the Bank of England, was put in the center of it after the event. And ever since then, Europe has been really leading a charge after a few beta tests, whether it be the Nigerian central bank or various others, for transitioning the euro into a digital central bank digital currency, which means the integration of monetary and fiscal policy. So if you remember at the beginning of the European Union, there was this whole debate around a monetary union and a fiscal union. Well, if you get the European Central Bank to be the issuer of the euro, which it currently is, and you take away essentially the ability to create the node operators, which are the banks, the private banks, which profit from the creation of the euro every time they issue a loan by ensuring debt slavery for those people that borrow to consume and get on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network versus those that lever up and use it in order to invest in real estate or leverage up. Then you have that massive wealth inequality where those are only assets based upon getting the cheapest rate by being at the 0% quantitative easing side of the central bank versus those that are, borrowing from node operators in the European banks by having 30% interest on credit card or 30% payday loans if they can't afford to live and cover their rent month to month in order to service the assets of the wealthy that were able to borrow at 0% through connections to quantitative easing or lobby groups, which allow them to rig the system. Well, of course, the ECB says, no, we don't want these node operators anymore. We want full issuance and control, because if we can codify fiscal policy, i.e. negative interest rates, compulsory vaccines, whatever policy they want, into the digital currency, then they can have full control over both monetary and fiscal policy through a central bank digital currency. And so EU nations, they have the choice. They can hedge against the euro because the euro has been a disaster and a cost of living crisis for anybody that has adopted the currency of the European Central Bank. And they can gain back some control should they choose without the politics of being, doing what the UK had to do where they Brexited from the European Union, even though they had their own currency. But they can hedge against that by building Bitcoin strategic reserves. And of course, the European Central Bank is saying, I'm pretty confident that no member of the European Union will ever be able to free themselves from the grips and the grip of death of the ECB by owning Bitcoin. So if anybody dares and wants to have a more Germany first policy or a UK first policy or an Italy first policy, then they should be building Bitcoin strategic reserves in case a black swan event and the proof of weapons network decides that the euro is no longer useful for us because we have milked it for all it's worth, and we transition over to the Fed because the Fed is having this strengthening currency, which is sucking all of the fiat currency out of all of the central banks that are members of the Bank for International Settlements, that are in debt slavery to the International Monetary Fund, that are printing their currencies and devaluing the wealth of their people at a faster and faster rate than the Federal Reserve, while they take those resources and rather than investing it in their own country's infrastructure, they simply lend it to the US government so that the US government can use it in order to execute covert operations around the world through the deep state, such as blowing up Nord Stream pipeline to destroy the German economy, while they're at the same time saying we're going to do tariffs so that you can't trade with China because we want you to buy our natural gas and we don't care about the impact on the European people. We don't care that it's a lot cheaper in Russia. We don't care that your goods are a lot cheaper in China. You must provide weapons to Ukraine and we'll push forward with NATO and ensure that your economies are destroyed as your central banks become printing presses for the military industrial complex so that the profits in the euro dollar market can all come back to Raytheon and General Dynamics and the profits of the US military contractors and various other things. And so that is essentially what is happening. Now, Bitcoin is the resistance against the terrorism of the European Central Bank. And every country can decide to do it. And if they do not, it means that they are co-opted and lobbied by the banksters or whoever it may be that is controlling their foreign policy as well as their domestic policy, such as at the very same time as Germany losing its cheap gas because the Nord Stream pipeline 2 was blown up by the CIA, at the very same time, they decided to turn off their nuclear power plants, which is the most efficient and cheapest form of energy that Germany, a industrial base, a manufacturing base, decided that was a good time to switch it off and invest in clean energy, which wasn't producing the energy that it needed, and decided to take it down while America decides that they're going to get off all those accords and leave the bag holder as the Europeans, while China is able to invest in clean energy at a significantly faster rate due to the economics of the Chinese economy as well. And so anyway, they should be building their Bitcoin strategic reserves and they should be holding it in treasury and not listening to the European Central Bank. That may lead to a tariff war if the Fed doesn't like what they're doing. Or it may lead to, at its extreme, sanctions if somebody like Hungary comes out and says, we like China's peace plan. They want to actually normalize between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they actually want to make sure that there is no war in the NATO expansion between Russia and Ukraine. And they want to make sure that, there is a, investment through the Belt and Road Initiative rather than debt slavery and destruction of currency through the economic hitmen at the International Monetary Fund. And therefore, we want to make sure that you definitely don't use Bitcoin as a strategic reserves, because they might be able to, break free from the ECB's Fed first policy, and many countries are deciding to hedge. So what are the different countries doing? Let's have a look at the news that we had this week, just this week in Bitcoin alone. Let's start with Norway. How about Norway? So Norway has one of the largest sovereign wealth funds, because what did Norway do? Well, it doesn't privatize its natural gas or its oil. It decides that it is utilizing it and putting together a sovereign wealth fund. And interestingly, if Norway wanted to do things in line with the new technology that exists today, it could decide to make everybody in the country shareholders in that sovereign wealth fund and put it in their pensions. But at the moment, it's got a sovereign wealth fund, and it is starting to hedge, but it's doing it slightly covertly. It is doing it in a way that supports demand for the dollars rather than supporting the Norwegian krona, which would be good for its own people. And so anyway, it is hedging its sovereign wealth fund slowly and almost quietly into Bitcoin. But there was some announcement on it today. So just so you know, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund is one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. Not many people talk about it. You tend to often hear about like Saudi Arabia and Qatar and UAE. But the Norwegian one is one of the largest in the world as well. But they have been building indirect Bitcoin exposure, and they now have an estimated 3,821 Bitcoin. Now, that is small, and it's a start, but it is a 153% year-on-year increase on what they had last year. But it appears that they're doing it indirect. So what does indirect mean? It means that they are going to the New York Stock Exchange or NASDAQ, or they're buying dollars with the Norwegian krona, or they are having international trade that settles in dollars. And then they're using those dollars not only to lend to the US government in order to receive yield to pump up the debt-based Ponzi scheme that perpetuates the wealth inequality within America, but also they are buying those dollars in order to invest in an ETF, so that ETF can then go and invest in Bitcoin. But it is the dollar that is buying the Bitcoin, which is not, rather than supporting the Norwegian krona, and rather than actually just going for Bitcoin direct. It is also investing in MicroStrategy. So MicroStrategy is raising finance from pension funds and various other fixed income, low risk investors that need to supplement because there is a pension crisis globally. And so they can lever up by buying and lending money to MicroStrategy. MicroStrategy creates a convertible note or a preference share. And then that convertible note is able to buy Bitcoin and allow the sovereign wealth fund in order to gain leveraged exposure to Bitcoin in order to try and supplement and support this pension crisis, because traditional asset classes are the victims of the Fed first policy that creates this hidden inflation that most asset classes cannot outperform unless you invest in the stock market, real estate, or of course, Bitcoin gave a global asset that anybody can invest in. So they started increasing their MicroStrategy position in the Norwegian fund. So they now have a $500 million, $514 million allocation to MicroStrategy. Other holdings include Bitcoin mining company, Marathon Digital, again, done through the US stock market. When China decided to make Bitcoin mining illegal in China, even though it still has about 15-16% of the hash power there, a chunk of that went over to Texas. Texas would repurpose its electricity, and it would make efficient energy and cartel wasted electricity by using Bitcoin mining. They would then float on the stock market, and the Norwegian wealth fund can then buy shares in Marathon and Riot and other companies like Coinbase. Full disclosure, Coinbase I was an investor in the private equity through Bank to the Future many years back, and still hold shares. Now they are a public company through that. But they're given exposure to the exchange, which is an investment in the ecosystem, mining through Marathon Digital, leverage Bitcoin through MicroStrategy, and spot Bitcoin, but via an ETF and a custodian via Bitcoin ETF. So this is slowly building its position, which every country can do, or they can do the sovereign strategy, which is actually to repurpose your assets in order to support your own currency and your own ecosystem so that it can be utilized more efficiently for your people. So another way of doing it, and this may be where they go, is that Norway is the fourth largest gas exporter. That is why it has such a large sovereign wealth fund, because other countries, they privatize their gas and they hand over all the profits and then they tax people, whereas other countries, they use their natural resources in order to reduce tax. But in Norway, that didn't work out too well because they got some of the highest tax rates at the same time as utilizing some of the gas. So there's something wrong that's happening there. But they managed to put a big sovereign wealth fund in the middle by doing that. But they could take their natural gas, which is the input valve into generating electricity. And electricity is what you use in order to mine Bitcoin. So they could build their own mining infrastructure utilizing the vast quantities of natural gas, which repurposes electricity into energy that powers a force against the European Central Bank and against the Fed. And then they can use that in order to invest in infrastructure, which is, essentially buying ASICs, which are mainly manufactured in China. And those ASICs is what allows you to mine Bitcoin, to plug your natural gas and electricity in, and then you're able to spit out Bitcoin every 10 minutes by connecting to a Bitcoin mining pool, fire up a node, and become a contributor to the proof of work network so that you can hedge yourself from the proof of weapons network in case the dollar ever becomes a weapon for tariffs in order to threaten you to change your national policy as well. And so rather than propping up the dollar and then the dollar exporting inflation and then you having to lend it back to the US government, which then creates an investment infrastructure within America, you can make sure that that all stays within your borders and you can have nice trade agreements without tariff threats, and we can have a more equal playing field as we reduce the demand for the dollar so that countries can really focus on their sovereignty rather than this proof of weapons network that's creating so much wealth inequality through the economic hitmen at the International Monetary Fund. And it is a benefit to your national security should you ever need to protect yourself in an environment of war where people don't trust each other's fiat currencies anymore. So historically, they would clear in gold, but gold is very, very difficult and requires the passage of seas. And in environments of financial embargoes and various other things that always happen during wars, there is a Red Sea one at the moment, you are able to send Bitcoin at the speed of light rather than having to have these large, heavy gold reserves that don't transport so easily and tend to disappear in the coffers of corruption as it is used collateral by central banks to steal the gold from the treasury and their people, which is what I believe has happened with the Federal Reserve, as it has used much of the gold that was confiscated from the American people in order to collateralize those loans. Okay, so this means that you go from the Norwegian kroner, which is your own currency, over to ASIC investments, which tends to involve, China, but you can get them and build your own manufacturing industry. Then that goes into gas to power it, which keeps all of the resources within your own country rather than just relying upon exports in case exports dry up or something happens to one of your largest customers like Europe. And then you can convert that energy into Bitcoin, and you can secure your position and be protected from any of the global currency wars or tariff threats. And in an environment where everyone is being threatened by tariffs, this is going to create a movement towards, national sovereignty and protection of resources. So that's how you can use Bitcoin in order to hedge. And this marks the beginning. And I think more and more countries are going to be pushing up the demand for Bitcoin. But it is a race for that Bitcoin. At the end of this section, I'll make sure you understand how scarce these Bitcoins are. But just before that, there is a very, very clever proof of weapons network, which is the Czech Republic one. Now, I have a little place in my heart for Czech Republic because I spoke at the very first Bitcoin conference in Europe in 2011, and it was in Prague in Czech Republic as well. But the Czech Republic central bank decided to not go down the path of relying upon the European central bank. And so now it has an autonomous central bank, but it is a member of the Bank for International Settlements and the economic hitmen at the International Monetary Fund. But it is doing a little bit of a resistance against that, and it is hedging by exploring alternative assets to back at the central bank level. Now, I am no fan of central banks building Bitcoin reserves. I want central banks to get weaker, not stronger. But that is a side effect of a free market. A free market means that your enemies can also use it. But if we end up creating a bottom-up movement in order to make and expose those central bank digital currencies, and they end up backed by Bitcoin, then at least those central bank digital currencies can be slightly better, not confiscating your wealth by having a floor, rather than having these sudden moves when you have these currency devaluations. And that, at least with all the oppression and everything that comes from that, at least you'll be able to utilize that as well. Okay. So Czech Republic, they're going to be voting. They did vote on Thursday, and it was just exploratory. Some people, kind of reported it as a bit more than it was. But it was a vote on researching whether they could have an allocation of up to 5% of their reserves to Bitcoin or other strategic assets. In total, that's approximately at maximum $7 billion worth of Bitcoin that they may be either, looking to acquire. In Czech Republic, as I said previously, where I spoke at the first Bitcoin conference in the world, a deep history in the early days of the cypherpunk movement with Bitcoin in the early days. I went there and the price of Bitcoin crashed from $30 to $3 while we were at the conference. But the Czech Republic Central Bank is deciding that it wants to put Bitcoin on its balance sheet, and it will be exploring that anyway. So it met on Thursday, and it got approval in order to research allocating up to 5% of its reserves in Bitcoin, which is up to $7 billion worth of Bitcoin. And that would make them the first European central bank proof of weapons network that has an allocations in the proof of work network. Try and get your head around that, but that's where we're headed. So they maintain their own currency. They're not on the euro, and so they get the autonomy to make these decisions without the banksters at the European Central Bank. And they said they got approval in order to research it further. And so where does that take us anyway? So we've got all these models that are emerging around the world as the proof of weapons network decides what it's going to do. Now it can't shut down this proof of work network. So we had El Salvador, which I would classify today as Bitcoin capital. We've had the International Monetary Fund that has come up against it and said, we don't want you making Bitcoin legal tender. We want you to have it just as a voluntary, which was the compromise, I guess. It didn't launch the Bitcoin bond, but it did take the $3.5 billion from the International Monetary Fund. It continued getting investment from China's Belt and Road Initiative in order to build out its infrastructure. And it was told that it needs to, after the Senate National Security hearing in America, it was told that it can't have a state-sponsored Bitcoin wallet for its people, and Chivo needs to unwind. So it is fighting as hard as it can, but it continues to add 1 Bitcoin per day, and it now owns over 6,000 Bitcoin, and hopefully it will be continuing to do that as well. In the meantime, if you remember, way back around episode 45 of Bitcoin Hard Talk, I did an interview with the candidate that wants to become the president of Suriname, which has an amazing opportunity because they're aiming if this happens and the Bitcoin community get behind her, Maya wants to make Bitcoin and using a fully open source policy for Suriname, which is a population of about 650,000. With vast resources, she's been exposing all the corruption, but she wants to make the whole thing with Bitcoin as a medium of exchange rather than a dollarized economy, and figure out how to tokenize the sovereign wealth fund on Bitcoin. Now that we are seeing all of this innovation happen on top of Bitcoin as well, since we've had the Taproot upgrade, as well as making it legal tender. So there is another chance to utilize that model of a sovereign wealth fund with Bitcoin as legal tender and Bitcoin as medium of exchange and an open source government in order to serve the people and stamp out corruption. But as we covered last week, US is aiming to become crypto capital of the world. And so there is a risk from this, as I covered last week. If you didn't watch it last week, check it out, of enriching coin holders and coin creators, which are essentially like an iteration of the proof of weapons network in a new form using decentralized blockchains as the mechanism for enriching through pre-mines and money printing, but then not being able to change the supply later, like the likes of Bragg Garlinghouse from Ripple Labs that put 60% of the token he printed or that Ripple Labs printed on the balance sheet of the company. And they are now using their wealth by becoming the third largest cryptocurrency, XRP, in order to lobby the Trump administration to ensure that their token becomes part of strategic reserves. So there is a real danger in the American model of, rather than freeing itself from the Federal Reserve, it could end up a shitcoin casino and lobby group and really enrich the coin pre-mine creators, rather just like what happened when the Federal Reserve designed the system to hand over the creation of the dollar to the private banks and commercial banks as it is today. So, they get to hijack the dollar, profit from its creation, get the world and the government and the companies and the individuals all into debt servitude to the dollar, because the Federal Reserve at any point can rug pull the economy by hiking rates or having transitory inflation rates, and really exert its influence over the economy. And the strategic reserve strategy was to use Bitcoin in order to accumulate. Still might end up doing that, but at the same time, it is designed to embrace all of the crypto, because Trump has a NFT collection, a stable coin to launch backed by treasuries, a DeFi project built upon Ethereum, 2 meme coins built upon Solana for both himself and his wife, a governance token that is built upon Ethereum that we'll find out what the regulatory hurdles are in launching governance tokens. And so this whole kind of shitcoin casino in order to become crypto capital of the world. And so BRICS at the meantime is watching all of these models. We've got the El Salvador model. We've got the Suriname model, hopefully. We've got the crypto capital US model. We've got the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund model. We've got the Czech Republic central bank model. And meanwhile, if you've watched previous episodes, I've always talked about BRICS that are looking to mint a unit on a distributed ledger technology, 60% backed by the currency of its members, which is subject to the Federal Reserve's proof of weapons network, and also backed by 40% gold. But the challenge with it is that when you mint it and you have to contribute gold to back the unit, you end up having this same physicality audit issue, which is the problem why America defaulted in 71 with the Nixon shock in the first place, because as soon as they needed to, they just stopped backing the dollar by gold. And so you could have a similar thing in this BRICS unit. So they're trying to create a decentralized distributed storage of gold, but it is still subject to the physicality and unauditability of a nation state rigging the system. So Bitcoin would be the perfect way to back it. And so as we move into these currency wars, America could have a Bitcoin strategic reserve. BRICS could start to back part of its units by Bitcoin. And then they can solve the auditability. And if one of those defaults and goes too far down the shitcoinery route, they could end up losing the currency war. And so I think Bitcoin is going to be at the center of this currency war as predicted, because this game theory is really playing out. And the one that gets it right gets to have the strongest currency, with Bitcoin being the regulator of the currency, because if it is convertible eventually into Bitcoin, then people can swap their proof of weapons network for proof of work. And therefore, they have to provide utility, even if it is a central bank digital currency. So get ready, buckle up. But if BRICS wants to use the El Salvador model, it could do that. And hopefully we can get more and more of these models in order to change the world one country at a time. Using Bitcoin, stamp out the bad models, because in this currency war, the bad models hopefully won't prevail. So we are certainly going to be able to use Bitcoin. America could decide to use it in order to maintain its dollar dominance. BRICS could use it in order to stamp out its dollar dominance. Countries on the wrong side of the proof of weapons network can go for a nationalist Bitcoin side, or there can be a collaborative model where the whole global south unifies around BRICS while the global north unifies around the dollar, and they always become subservient to the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and the Bank for International Settlements and the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank in this proof of weapons network, that if they overthrow too many governments, as they have been ever since World War I, World War II, and the Cold War and the War on Terror, and the covert deep state operations that have been done, then people could go towards the global south, or they can opt out altogether in Bitcoin. All we know is that if America decides to become focusing on meme coins while the rest of the world focuses on Bitcoin, then this could be an incredible opportunity to create that friction. And I think America would have to demonstrate that when you focus on meme coins too far and not Bitcoin, you could end up on the wrong side. So President Trump, this is a tool that you do have alongside your stable coins, which is full reserve banking, alongside your tariffs. You also have the opportunity to use Bitcoin in order to free yourself from the Federal Reserve and truly be remembered as the person that brought a significant sea change in the deep state. But my guess is that that won't happen. The Federal Reserve will reduce rates. There may be this battle between that I've always talked about, but at least we get to push everything at the forefront. and you can opt out. You can opt out of all of these fiat currencies, every dollar, every euro, every yen, every pound, every Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, all of them that allow the banks to create the money backed by debt. Any money in your online banking is somebody else's debt in a Ponzi scheme that requires more debt in order to pay the interest on the digital currency that is printed by the private banks, guaranteed that to create inflation, to create wealth inequality. You can opt out by saving in a Bitcoin. The Bitcoin, if you have dollar cost average every single month for at least 4 years, every single person in the world has beaten every single proof of weapons network and every single asset class. And you get to do a peaceful protest and boycott of all the wars that are funded through these central banksters, which is the reason they were created in the first place. And then they get to re-divert that money away. So that is what you get to do. You get to opt out. And I hope more and more of you decide to opt out with your savings, and you figure out not financial advice, but a mechanism for planning that around. At the same time, President Trump is really threatening 100% tariffs on any BRICS nations that want to get involved in anything in competing with the dollar. Now, personally, I believe it's somewhat of an empty threat, because 100% tariff on China is probably really a threat around Brazil, and making sure that they don't trade outside the dollar. However, we get to see what will happen as a result of these. And so we have more and more threats. So if anyone engages in this BRICS network, apparently they will be getting 100% tariffs, which will obviously drive more adoption to a global South unification in order to enter a multipolar world, so that they don't have to be subservient to the US dollar proof of weapons network. And all of this really only ends up in a shrinking of the US economy, which, if the goal is to pay down the national debt, then that would lead to a massive depressionary side, because you're wiping out dollars. And these tariff threats, if they go in the wrong way, then it could be a movement towards a much, much smaller US economy focused on nationalism and its domestic, which obviously is significantly smaller than the proof of weapons network blowing and overthrowing governments to make sure they prop up the demand for the dollar globally. This is such an interesting time, and why it was necessary to get this regime change from Genocide Joe and Holocaust Harris in America, so we can move forward with exposing the proof of weapons network for what it is. At the same time, 11 US states have now introduced bills in order to have a Bitcoin strategic reserves and protect themselves from the federal level and the Federal Reserve. So states are deciding to push back and build their own strategic reserves, and that is a very, very positive thing for having more options for states, as the Federal Reserve and these tariffs may backfire as we watch this whole experiment unfold. At the same time, Eric Trump, Donald Trump's son, he came out and said that any US-based crypto projects will benefit from zero capital gains tax. So I guess that is an indication that this is the president's son that is running their own crypto projects. So to be able to get tax relief is an indication of what happens when you align your self-interest with what they may deem the national interest to become crypto capital. But remember, for all of the executive orders, it still has to go via Congress. This is not a monarchy. This is not the deep state. When an executive order is issued, it has to go through the congressional process with the Senate side being able to push back as well. But at the same time, this week in the crypto side, we saw more and more from World Liberty Financial, which is a project launched by Trump. The token sale is reaching near an end. And so they decided, once all the tokens were sold, they did the whole rug pull of Now there is so much demand that we decided to sell more tokens to you. And so there were 20 billion tokens issued, which was sold at approximately 0.015 cents, which raised approximately 300 million, not billion. But they had to get Justin Sun involved in order to try and sell it out. And so Justin Sun, who has a case against the SEC, who is the creator of TRX, which led to some of the reserves at World Liberty Financial being denominated in TRX tokens after a $75 million investment, as the TRX lobby, headed up by Justin Sun, looks to exert influence over the future of various projects and can find a covert way in. And in order to cater for the fact that this sold out all of those tokens, World Liberty Financial said, congratulations, we're going to sell 5 billion more tokens. And they're not going to be at 0.015 cents. These are going to be at 5 cents so that we could lock in an uplift so that when the tokens trade, there's a over 100% uplift in that, which ordinarily would have been a big transparency problem when you doing any type of securities offering. But they're going to be launching and be a part of the crypto SAR that's going to be looking at reforming the SEC into a pro-crypto environment. So World Liberty Financial now has $500 million raised by issuing a governance token. And that governance token is now being used in order to buy wrap Bitcoin, Ethereum, and various other things. And Justin Sun is pretty much the lead investor in order to get a looking at implementing and shaping the future of crypto policy, who is somebody that was escaping the China proof of weapons network. And we get these very interesting things to watch. So we shall see. Will Justin Sun's SEC case be dropped? Let's watch it. But at the same time, if you remember in 2020, Trump also launched a public company because he was censored both financial blockade from the banking lobby and JP Morgan, and also the social media when Twitter had to take out and wipe out Trump's account, and YouTube wiped out Trump. So he launched a company which went public via a SPAC, which was Trump Media, or DJT is the ticker symbol. And he launched his own social network so he couldn't be censored. And Trump's media company, DJT, has now filed a trademark for what is called Truth-Fi. And so it looks like there is going to be some synchronization between World Liberty Financial and the social media platform Truth, in order to build it into some kind of financial platform as well. And they also looked to launch within the company a cryptocurrency payment platform. So we shall see what they do with Truth-Fi. Trump Media also decided that, made an announcement that the company would be investing in Bitcoin and similar cryptocurrencies. And it announced a TradFi partner in order to do that, which means that maybe it will be doing ETFs, maybe it will be purchasing Bitcoin, maybe it will be using and issuing the Michael Saylor MicroStrategy strategy of attracting corporate debt holders in order to buy Bitcoin. But DJT is going to be a social media platform, a payments platform, maybe partnering with World Liberty Financial, and also implementing what looks like a Bitcoin treasury strategy by utilizing a SPAC to reverse into a social media platform and true financial engineering to probably issue corporate debt and maybe preference shares. We will keep covering that as this company is looking to become a full-blown Bitcoin crypto play as well. So all of this means really that the US is going all in on crypto, and it is looking to be crypto capital of the world. So get ready. Crypto is definitely here to stay. And the next few years is going to shape the future of the environment. as other countries as well have already got their virtual asset service provider regimes, and maybe America gets its virtual asset service provider regime. At the same time, NASDAQ filed in order to allow, this is really interesting, in-kind creation and redemption for the BlackRock Bitcoin ETF. Now, what this means is two things. It could be a Trojan horse, which is that you could take your Bitcoin and rather than selling your Bitcoin and having to buy dollars and then realizing a capital gain, and then using those dollars in order to buy the Bitcoin ETF, you could actually go directly from Bitcoin to the Bitcoin ETF and potentially, which I would be very surprised, redeem those units directly into Bitcoin, which in a risk event, where we got banks that are now going to be allowed to have Bitcoin on their balance sheet. And by the way, storing Bitcoin with a fractional reserve bank means that if the bank gets their credit risk policy wrong, you could end up with that bank in bankruptcy, an FDIC takeover, and your Bitcoin won't be insured in kind by FDIC. It will be insured by dollars, which means that it's like those bankruptcy process like FTX and Celsius, where your Bitcoin gets converted into a dollar claim. And obviously there is massive risk at banks. The small ones might be gobbled up by the large ones, and you might be pushed into a forced sell. So storing them with a fractional reserve bank is significantly riskier than buying a Bitcoin ETF. At least the Bitcoin ETF is backed by Bitcoin in custody, which is, again, significantly riskier than if you have a good strategy for storing in cold storage, so that you can, manage risks between, this is one of the things I do in case all the very secure cold storage setup goes wrong. At least I hedge that with some in custody, and I hedge most of it in custody with cold storage. Later this year when we do the Bitcoin Wealth Builder program again, I'll make sure that everyone understands how to really risk manage these different types of risks. As long as you are accumulating Bitcoin and dollar cost averaging, you need to start thinking of these things as your Bitcoin wealth grows anyway. Took a little bit of a tangent there. But we've now got this authorization of banks to get into the Bitcoin game. And if this Bitcoin redemption and Bitcoin being able to buy that is a very, very interesting development from the BlackRock ETFs. And obviously the BlackRock lobby is the one that can make it happen, which is why many of the Democrat lining financial Silicon Valley type people, they all had to pivot in order to be Trump's best friend to make sure that much of that lobby money is making its way to the Trump administration. And so anyway, BlackRock could be authorized and NASDAQ could be the custody or the issuer to allow for participants to buy and redeem shares in the Bitcoin ETF using their Bitcoin, which is a really interesting development. MicroStrategy continues on the corporate side. MicroStrategy has now, they announced that they bought another 10,117 Bitcoin. That is $1.1 billion at an average price of $105,596 per Bitcoin, which is bringing the MicroStrategy position up to 471,117 Bitcoin. And that was acquired for approximately $30.4 billion at an average of 64,541 per Bitcoin. And the new rules, the FISB rules, where you can mark your Bitcoin to balance sheet, have just been implemented. And so there was a massive gain marked in terms of the revenue for MicroStrategy as per those new rules, which means as the price crashes, you get the unrealized losses. And as the market goes up, you get unrealized gains, which makes a more fair reflection of the value of the public company as they publicly report those balance sheets. And so more and more people are going to be able to utilize those rules in order to do additional capital raises through the public markets, much like probably DJT is going to be doing as part of the Trump media empire that is being built. Now we also had Coinbase, which is playing the full lobby. Coinbase hired somebody from instrumental in the Trump campaign to their board, so that they're making sure that those positions are lined up. And they also had one of the players from the New York Federal Reserve, because at the moment they just launched their USDT, Bitcoin-backed USDC loans, based upon their base, which is their layer 2 on top of Ethereum, and all of this Lego is being built out. And they were the ones that many of their services weren't able to be offered in New York, so they increased their board by having one of the ex-Fed members from New York make sure that Coinbase becomes relevant as more and more traditional financial players use their immense lobby power in order to make sure that Bitcoin is being used to support the banks. Remember, Bitcoin doesn't need the banks. The banks need Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't need the central banks. The central banks need Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't need America. America needs Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't need BRICS. BRICS need Bitcoin. But we can all protect ourselves and allow them to figure it out at whatever stage they want. Another one that happened on the public markets as more and more. This one's a bit self-serving. At Bank to the Future, we did the funding round for Exodus, the seed round. We invested at a $5 million valuation, and Exodus rung the bell on the New York Stock Exchange, and they are now publicly tradable and passed over $2 billion of market capitalization. Congratulations, any Bank to the Future investors, just like the Bank to the Future Coinbase investors were investing when it was private and ended up getting those public shares as well. But Coinbase also announced that they have received regulatory approval to launch its crypto services inside Argentina. And so more and more Argentinians are going to have a pro-crypto or Bitcoin environment in order to protect themselves from the Central Bank of Argentina and the International Monetary Fund economic hitmen that have essentially got that country so indebted that it created one of the largest welfare states and destroyed its currency in order to service its dollar debt in the Bank of International Settlements and International Monetary Fund proof of weapons network. We had some of those leftover fines from the Biden administration, SEC, Gary Gensler empire. KuCoin, which is an exchange that I have never used and I will never use, but they agreed to pay a $297 million fine to the US government for operating with US people as an unlicensed money transmitter business. And so therefore they paid their fine, and hopefully they're going to be able to move on as well. We had David. Oh, this is a story I want to cover as well. This is an important lesson for everybody as well. So as you get, one of the parts of owning your own assets is that you need to be able to secure your own assets, and that creates a personal security thing. So as people get more and more Bitcoin rich, safety of the country that they live in becomes more and more important. It's why many Bitcoiners, they end up relocating for a multitude of reasons. But one of those people stayed in France, which is the country they were born in. And I want to cover it just as it was absolutely shocking. But David Belland, he co-founded Ledger. I was actually meant to be an investor in Ledger. It's a hardware wallet that allows people to own their own Bitcoin and crypto. And it's like a device. It's got no real connection to Ledger. You obviously run software so that you can store it offline without, having to, basically go through a wallet that is stored by somebody else. And so Ledger is one of those players. But Ledger, basically, the co-founder was kidnapped. And it was completely shocking. He was tortured as a ransom, being a real wake-up call for everybody to really focus on their personal safety moving forward. This has always been a focus. And one of these bad side effects of becoming wealthy is you become a target. And some people have not been protecting themselves, to the degree that they should. And so this really comes into protecting, deciding what country you live in. So this happened, last Tuesday. And David and his wife, they were both kidnapped. And this was in France. The criminals demanded a ransom from basically another Ledger co-founder. So they were looking at his relationship with his company, kidnapped him, tortured him, and then was sending the video to the co-founder, and used WhatsApp accounts linked to an Asian, system of to avoid tracking, and a privacy network built into that, and basically contacted the co-founder of Ledger, and then demanded that as a test transaction that they, firstly send over a bunch of Bitcoin. And so they sent over one Bitcoin, which is valued at approximately $105,000 at the time. And they did that in order to buy some time while they were tracking the kidnappers, and the French authorities were coming after them. So this is Tuesday. They sent through the one Bitcoin after the kidnapping. And then on Wednesday, the police stopped, basically a stolen car that was linked to the criminals. They arrested the driver, and then they were able to track that to another phone, to a town nearby in France. They basically found David alive, based upon this connection as well. But he was mutilated. They decided to send a video where they were chopping off his finger, in order to demonstrate to Ledger that they were taking this seriously. So this was a just really, really shocking thing. And, this just reminds us that we need to really focus on personal security and making sure that while the proof of weapons network is taking these countries through debt servitude to more and more violence through wealth inequality and inflation, that is causing a very risky scenario for those that are escaping the proof of weapons network through proof of work as well. And so basically they sent a video of mutilating and chopping off his finger as proof, in order to try and ransom more and more and more. The French authorities, anyway, they arrested 10 suspects. 9 of them were men. There was 1 woman, and they were aged between 20 and 40. Apparently, the news was that they were part of a larger criminal organization. And so this was organized criminal network, as opposed to an individual just looking to do a ransom. So expect more of this, and people need to make sure they're protecting themselves. This is a message to everybody, that people need to start thinking about this. Your wealth, unfortunately, makes you a target. And that is a reality that has always been, and will continue to be. So the message anyway is that you need to start thinking about your personal security, safety, being in a country where safety is prioritized, and there is not too much wealth inequality from the proof of weapons network. You also, if you're going to be going through relocation, you need to be planning inheritance as your wealth grows. And then there are all side effects as you pick your country. Then maybe there is tax efficiency. Maybe there are countries that are going to be implementing exit tax, wealth tax, and various other things. And so, I don't want to overwhelm you, but one of the things we've always done in the Bitcoin Wealth Builder program is make people think about relocation strategies, inheritance strategies, tax strategies, all within the confines of the law, as you're also planning your personal safety, and what you would do in these types of things as well. So it is a reminder of us. We also had another reminder as well, that there has always been these high-profile arrests. So while we moved to, Russ Ulbricht being pardoned by the Trump administration, many people have also been looking for a pardon as well. Now, one of those people was early Bitcoin investor Roger Ver. And think what you like about Roger Ver. I'll never forget, I invested in many of the early companies that he invested in the early days when no one was supporting our industry. He went down a different path in the block war debate. I disagreed. If you look at my old YouTube channels, I was debating Roger Ver in Japan about on the Bitcoin side, while he was supporting the Bitcoin Cash side, which was a hard fork created by Bitmain, the ASIC manufacturer. In 2014, because he was, targeted for selling illegal firecrackers, nobody else was targeted, but he was arrested for that. He claims that he has been targeted by US officials, made him have to and want to leave America, even though he didn't really want to leave. And so he left in 2014. There were emails of him trying to ensure that it was done in the correct way. There may have been, I haven't looked deeply into the case, there may have been things that were done wrong or not. He claims his innocence. He ceased being a citizen of America. And then there's been a long-term campaign to say that he owed the tax. He claims that he constantly would contact the IRS, make sure it was done properly, said that he wanted to settle, but instead they recently, 10 years after the fact, even though he wasn't a US citizen, they decided to arrest him in Spain, and we don't know what's happening. So he launched a campaign to try and get a presidential pardon as well, because they want to extradite him to America. And this is really, I think, a bit of lawfare in order to make sure that people are looking at those old Bitcoins and declaring things as the government wants to ransom more money, but using lawfare, doing the same as what happened with the illegal ransoms, but looking to do it legally. And, think what you want about Roger Ver. I'd look into that, because I believe that separate your opinions on what he did with Bitcoin Cash from whether Roger deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. I don't think he does. Speaking of other people, a member of the Proof of Weapons network that I believe was arbitraging Bitcoin with the Japan Proof of Weapons network, using the carry trade in order to arbitrage Bitcoin, and then created a fraudulent company called Alameda Research, would then launch an exchange in order to steal client money in the billions and put it all at risk. And use that in order to bribe politicians and the Democrat Party and launder money into Ukraine. Sam Bankman-Fried decided that now there is a Trump administration, his parents are chancing their luck and seeking a Trump pardon for the FTX founder, who is now servicing up to 25 years and may get about 11 years on good behavior. But the parents of SBF, who are MIT lobby specialists, may be able to try and exert their power over Trump. We shall see what that happens. But that was another case of this wave of people. We'll keep covering these so that we can follow the money and understand the flows as well. In the final part of Bitcoin news, we've got a little bit more to go. USDT, who relocated to El Salvador, decided that they're going to be now launching Tether on top of Lightning, which is awesome. This means that you can have much, much cheaper Lightning transactions of Tether on Lightning from El Salvador, which I think is a really, really interesting development. I love personally using Lightning. It hasn't got much traction. I use if you are on using Nostr, which is a decentralized social media platform, where if one of the clients that build an application on top of Nostr gets predatory, like I use Jack, the founder of Twitter's Primal. I use that in order to connect to the Nostr network, but you can take your social media data and your entire history, upload it to another client, and it allows you to take all your data with you in case you get ransomed by X or Facebook or any of those people as well. And so if you're on Nostr, make sure you connect to me over there. You can find me over there as well. But whenever you post, you get all these sats come through on the Lightning network. And even though the amount of money is tiny, no matter how Bitcoin rich you get, it's still kind of exciting to receive these sats and support the circular economy. And so whenever I receive some sats, I try and support someone else as well, so that we can start, getting more and more people and adoption on the Lightning network, which is cheap transactions on top of Bitcoin, which with instant settlement and additional privacy enhancements as well. But now we're going to have Tether, and maybe this will be the killer application, having Tether on top of Bitcoin Lightning, which can integrate with sats and sharing in the circular economy. And that's now launched from El Salvador, and we look forward to seeing where that goes. Right, so let's do some closing stories. I was doing some calculations on Bitcoin, and there was a post which I saw as well on X that was doing some calculations of what the average inflow into Bitcoin has been like for the last 3 months. And so with the addition of ETFs, BlackRock added approximately 100,000 Bitcoin over the last 3 months to be held in custody for its clients. MicroStrategy added 84,000 Bitcoin over the last 3 months for those that are to get exposure to leverage Bitcoin through MicroStrategy. And Fidelity, another ETF provider and custodian, added 26,000 Bitcoin over the last 3 months. Essentially, when you combine that with a few more, on average, over the last 3 months, if the next 3 months looks like the last 3 months, and that continues, and there's no guarantee it will, but these providers alone are gobbling up approximately 300,000 Bitcoin per quarter. Translate that into 1 year, that's 1.2 million Bitcoin per year that they're gobbling up to be holding for clients. Now, when you look at the Bitcoin Block Explorer, because the monetary policy is 100% fixed, there'll only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, and miners will be rewarded for adding blocks every 10 minutes. We had the halving in 2024. The next halving is in 2028. This will carry all the way through to 2140, long after our life, depending on technology and whether we get elongation of life. But already, if you look at the Block Explorer to now, 19.8 million Bitcoin have already been mined. And so there is only 1.2 million Bitcoin left to be mined in the entire Bitcoin network. And so they're gobbling up 1.2 million if you take this 3 months over 1 year. And in the entire time, there's only 1.2 million Bitcoin left to mine, which means that they have to buy it from somebody else and persuade somebody to sell. In order to persuade people like me, I would never buy dollars with my Bitcoin. Why would I buy fiat currency proof of weapon network with my peaceful proof of work? Well, the only reason is if I needed to purchase something. So I manage my purchases in a way where I don't have to sell my Bitcoin. And so, those that are going to be persuaded to sell, which means that those that are saving in Bitcoin means that if this demand continues, just those players alone, there's not enough Bitcoin in the entire future of mining for 1 year of supply. Do the maths. This is called stock to flow. And this is just basic supply and demand economics as well. Obviously, things can change. There'll be systemic risk events, but those create opportunities to take your fiat currency and buy cheaper on the proof of work network as well. So anyway, this week as well, we had the FOMC, where the shareholders of the Federal Reserve nominate one bankster in order to meet and determine the future of the American proof of weapons network, whether they want to yank the economy, rug the economy, or support the economy. And they met to support the interest of their shareholders, as the Federal Reserve has always done since 1913. And Jerome Powell gives the public speech as the head of the Federal Reserve. And suddenly, in his speech, while they were talking about rates, I'll cover a bit more in the macro section, he started talking about how banks should own Bitcoin. Why not? Casually talking about crypto, just casually walking back everything he's ever said and saying that, yeah, he would like to create an environment for banks to own some Bitcoin, as if it's a casual conversation. And the SEC, has a regulatory regime in order to support the banks in holding Bitcoin and crypto as well. And everything is fine. Forget about Operation Choke Point 2.0, where the Federal Reserve deliberately coordinated attack with the SEC and the financial terrorists like Gary Gensler and Jerome Powell made sure that no banks, were able to, support the Bitcoin community. And I've talked about it many times. I don't want to go back into it here. But Nick Carter, used and coined the phrase Operation Choke Point 2.0. But suddenly the Federal Reserve, now that BlackRock's got the ETF and all the other players, and we got the Trump administration, suddenly, it's just normal. It's a casual conversation that banks should be able to buy Bitcoin and support the crypto industry. Anyway, that was that casual comment. So Operation Choke Point 2.0 is officially over, and TradFi is looking to catch up with Bitcoin in order to protect itself as we transition to these different currency wars. Speaking of currency wars, tomorrow, Saturday, Trump is going to have his official tariff policy is going to be coming into action. And why did he do it over the weekend? Well, the same reason why FDIC takes over banks over the weekend, because it doesn't want the market to react. So the only market that is open during the tariff war being launched and becoming official policy will be Bitcoin and currencies. And so this becomes the important markets in these currency wars to determine what happens on Monday when the stock market opens. And so we will watch Bitcoin tomorrow and the FX markets and the reactions of the Canadian dollars, the Mexican peso, the US dollar, and all of the knock-on effects on Bitcoin as the tariff policy comes into force and tariffs become a war for political negotiations. And so with that in mind, that's all we got for the Bitcoin section. We're now going to move over to the macro section. And if you enjoyed this, do me a favor, subscribe to YouTube. If you are not a subscriber, and I go through the stats of all the viewers, and many of you are watching this without subscribing. If you don't subscribe, you won't get a notification because YouTube does not rank any of the content because it doesn't like the content that I give in the geopolitical section. So what I need you to do is subscribe. And then YouTube, if you hit the bell symbol and hit all, YouTube will give you a notification and let you know when I'm live, rather than you having to rely upon emails. Also join simondixon.com. Join the Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal for free so that I can make sure that you get the backup and I can email you when I go live so you don't miss an update as we transition to a world of Bitcoin, AI, and central bank digital currencies. I also upload additional videos that are not on YouTube as well. So make sure you do that. And then do me a favor, easily just do a like, a subscribe, a comment. I'm just going to protect my voice by taking some water, and then we're going to jump into the second section where we go through macro. Give me a second. Okay, we're in part 2 of the Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 68, where we're going to be going through the macro section, the impact on Europe, and as we said in the Bitcoin section, tomorrow, Trump's tariff come into play. So let's take a little look at the European Central Bank Euro Proof of Weapons Network. I already said in the Bitcoin section that it is my belief that the ECB has a Fed first policy and countries need to be protecting themselves and strengthening themselves by building Bitcoin strategic reserves, because everything the ECB is doing is strengthening the dollar and having an America first policy. And just doing that at the expense of the European people and its member countries. So all currencies are currently being used to be weakened relative to the dollar. Now you get short-term fluctuations, but in general, the trend of these currencies are that they're suffering higher inflation than America. The Fed is exporting its inflation. People through the IMF network are in debt, paying off their dollar debt and then lending it to the US government. And then you have all of these covert operations like the euro dollar, the petrodollar, and various other operations that we covered that is artificially strengthening the dollar, weakening the currency for the domestic people. And this is creating inflation plus a weakening at the same time as pension crisis, excessive leverage, and making sure that all that money is going back into things like NATO being used to increase the amount of money that goes back into the American military industrial complex and further strengthening the dollar again, which is causing this issue where Canada is in recession, UK is in recession, Germany is in recession. And all of that, during that time, there is no infrastructure investment. This is why the Federal Reserve is creating these demand for dollars all around, and the European Central Bank is just simply a tool for perpetuating that against the European people. There is a side effect of a strengthening dollar, and the strengthening dollar is that US imports become cheaper. And now the US doesn't want to be importing because Trump has a nationalization promise that it's going to be America first. America first means bring the jobs back into America, build manufacturing in America, but those manufacturers, they have to import certain goods because countries like China has a virtual monopoly on all of the minerals that are needed as those inputs because they're significantly cheaper. And so cheaper imports means that American companies have to import at the same time as being told that we're moving towards national. So all of this has incredibly complex side effects, but it differs from the onshore manufacturing promise. And so you have these competing agendas that is going to be involved in many of these currency wars as we go through. Now, the Federal Reserve, they came out and they decided that they're going to be pausing the decreases in interest rates. And so the hiking has, there's going to be no hikes, and there's going to be, this was a pause. I mean, the market expected this, so not really much reaction, not really much surprise. But the Federal Reserve Proof of Weapon Network, they're going to be keeping rates remaining at 4.25 to 4.5%, and because inflation is getting worse, it went from, as they were doing the cuts, it went from 2.4% to 2.6% to now 2.7%, according to CPI. This is during a strengthening dollar, which perpetuates the effect, kind of hides the impact of inflation, while the everyday people are wondering why it is being harder and harder because their wages aren't increasing at the same rate. And then they start taking that out on immigration. You then have an attack on illegal immigration, because countries should always, favor legal immigration over illegal immigration. But the people like Elon Musk decide that they're going to use legal immigration for their favor at the same time. And you have this technocratic lobbying pressure that we always see when you follow the money that is getting in the way of policy as well. Right. So one of those currencies that is deeply impacted is the Canadian dollar. So the Canadian dollar has been, contracting relative to the US dollar at the same time as the cost of living crisis. And that money is then being used to protect and then spent in America. So America wants to do more of this at the same time as implementing tariffs, so that the Federal Reserve and the US empire can have an expansive vision of supporting a Canadian recession to try and join America in one singular mission, as it is doing with Mexico, as it is doing with Europe as well. It is deciding, follow us, or we destroy your economy. So you're getting the allies that are now essentially turning on each other. That is driving people to choose. Do I want to be a part of BRICS Global South, or do I want to continue this strategy, which is not working? It's destroying our economy by becoming a Fed first and an America first central bank. And that is the choice that the European sovereign nations need to decide as they move forward, which is why the countries that will decide we want to choose sovereignty will be ignoring the guidance of the European Central Bank and building their own sovereign strategic reserves, while they go to a nationalist agenda and then they decide, well, do I want to buy America's expensive gas, or do I want Russia's, or do I want to support, these different corridors that are being built through the Middle East that require peace in the Middle East in order to have those corridors prevail, which then requires a resolution to the Palestinian cause. And we'll cover more of that in the geopolitical section as well. But the ECB has basically been cutting rates. Canada has been cutting rates. The EU, Canada, and Mexico are spending more and more and strengthening the dollar, which is a side effect. The proof of weapons network that was constructed after World War II in the Bank of Japan, it actually raised its interest rates. So it went from 0.5% to 0.25%. That has massive impacts on the Japan carry trade and the implications on the derivatives market, because people are borrowing all of this free money from Bank of Japan because of its interest-free environment. And that has impacts on the derivatives and the swaps that are constructed through the investment bank. But it is reducing the demand for free money, which is free money that is normally invested in the US stock market that has to be converted into dollars to drive up the demand for dollars and drive up the US stock market prices as well. Now, in Europe, the situation is getting worse and worse and worse. Germany is deep in a recession. It is deciding now, it could follow the path that America is following on Canada and Mexico, which is that if Germany decides that it wants to work collaboratively with BRICS, it wants to strengthen its manufacturing base with China, it wants to continue repairing what the CIA blew up with Nord Stream Pipeline 2 in order to get its cheap gas, and it wants to rebuild its nuclear power plants in order to get in-house, natural gas and cheaper electricity, then if it doesn't buy it from America, it could suffer tariffs as well. And so all of these different countries are going to have to decide, do I want to ally with BRICS? Do I want to ally with America? But America has taken them deep, deep, deep into recession with all these covert operations, which is what the expansion of NATO was in the first place, collateralized by all of the BlackRock companies that are driving all of this inbound investment from NATO into BlackRock portfolio companies, collateralized by the Bank of England and the International Monetary Fund that now owns approximately half of the assets of Ukraine as Trump starts to cut off the supply and Europe either double down and end up giving all of those assets to the globalist agenda, which is more powerful than the US government. The Federal Reserve, the deep state, and the globalist agenda is where the real power lies. And so they have no allegiance to America. They didn't have allegiance to, the Bank of England didn't have allegiance to the UK. It was more than happy to switch after World War I to America. And it could do the same with BRICS. It cares about global. It doesn't really care about that. So this is going to drive a nationalist agenda, a shrinking of the US economy, despite the fact that Trump is promising, essentially it is repackaging a shrinking of the economy and a contraction of the debt, which leads to a shrinking of the economy because the banks create the dollar, in the name of nationalism, to justify why all these tariffs are happening. And rather than actually doing what needs to happen, which is radical monetary reform, hopefully Trump will build the Bitcoin strategic reserves. And when the Fed no longer works and he figures this out, maybe it's into the next administration, America can restructure itself just like JFK did in 1963, issue dollars that are convertible into, at that time it was silver, could be convertible into Bitcoin in order to actually create a resistance movement against the Federal Reserve and remove back to constitutional money if it chooses and save their economies from the unaffiliated Federal Reserve, ECB, and the globalist deep state agendas that has no allegiance to any country that was created from the Bank of England model in the first place as well. So Trump officially announced that there's going to be 25% tariffs on Mexico and Canada. And this starts tomorrow. And we'll be watching the price of Bitcoin, and we'll be watching the FX markets in order to determine what we'll be covering next week. So I really look forward to doing that. This move could really devalue, the global tech supply. And many of the chains that could spark a massive slowdown in working with US allies. It will take 6 months to a year in order for these trends to come through. But people are going to have to make some serious choices as these tariffs come through. Now, remember, there was a really interesting trend, and I'm sure you all saw it. It seems like it was a long time ago, but this was right after Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 67. China fired a ginormous weapon of mass destruction, a technical one in the trade war, with the launch of DeepSeek. And immediately, just like we're going to have the tariffs that come through this weekend, because it was launched on a Saturday, the only market that was open was Bitcoin. So Bitcoin created a lovely dip below 100K. And I hope you got an opportunity to dollar cost average in and get your below 100K Bitcoin. But Bitcoin had a big reaction, which is a leading indicator of the short-term risk on stock market. Longer term is completely uncorrelated because Bitcoin has its own fixed money supply. But we can read the weekend, and DeepSeek released this AI tool, and Bitcoin took this big initial dip, and then the futures market started betting on a massive crash in the US stock market, leading into the opening on Monday. And this was all around the fact that the largest 7 tech stocks in America, potentially led by NVIDIA, which uses chips in Taiwan, which is the whole battle with the Biden administration sanctioning Taiwan in order to try and stop chips going to China, which is basically escalating the need for China to reunify with Taiwan and remove from the status quo, and a reversal of the US policy, basically, by using semiconductor chips as a weapon of mass destruction. Well, that didn't work. China was producing chips. The chips from Taiwan are still getting into China. And it turns out that they could do artificial intelligence without the billions and billions of dollars that is required to invest in building out these massive data centers that NVIDIA has made it this $3 trillion company, with the growth of companies like ChatGPT that are building out these artificial intelligence. And DeepSeek, whether you believe it or not, it may not be true, but everyone that I've said that looked into it has created a vastly superior artificial intelligence, open source, at a fraction of the data centers and compute that is needed in order to run that AI. That created an absolute shockwave in the stock market. I started posting on X, expect a crazy Monday and a correction from NVIDIA, which was a $3 trillion market cap, and it wiped off 600 billion of market capitalization. Now, does this mean that this, all of the companies will react? But it destroyed some of the business models that had billions and billions of dollars in investment that was being poured in from the proof of weapons network through the Bank of Japan carry trade, at the same time as these interest rates rising, which was created the last Black Monday. And of course, eventually this leads to the Fed deciding what is its tool that it's going to launch, which eventually I think it wants to do a massive build up until it picks the right moment that you have the systemic risk event in the banks. And then you decide to bail it out with a new tool, which is a central bank digital currency, which the Trump administration is issuing executive orders to prevent, because if America wanted to free itself, it could issue that tool based upon a stable coin by dollars, or it could use its technocrat partners. Facebook always wanted to launch a stable coin X has announced this partnership with Visa to become a payments platform. As the stablecoin regulations come through, you can bet your bottom dollar that these technical companies want to be the future of the dollar as well, which could create this interesting battle between Treasury and Fed as well. But the DeepSeek, apparently, the compute that was needed in order to launch this more powerful artificial intelligence was only $6 million. Now, you could believe that's true or not. There could be a massive propaganda campaign, but it completely changed the game. It open sourced. Everyone started to test it. Everyone started to do that. Now your data's going to China, but we know from Snowden that your data goes to the NSA. And we know from the fact that platforms like X do their KYC through Israeli companies. And we know through the CrowdStrike takedown and the artificial intelligence that there is a lot of data that goes from Silicon Valley to Israel, which is a big part of, this whole proof of weapons network as well. But you can pick your, where the data goes, but it's open source now as well. We are also looking at driving that innovation now that that tool has been done, where we can put that on decentralized network, and hopefully Bitcoin with these lightning layer networks and the fact that Tether is now lightning on top of Bitcoin through El Salvador, hopefully we can put all this together to even have decentralized artificial intelligence, which would be a huge gift to humanity. So China gave a ginormous gift to the world, drove this into an open source war, drove down the cost, and now America react. And I think America will create, better stuff. And then Alibaba made an announcement that it's got better than DeepSeek, but this was a real win for consumers, a real reversal in terms of the control that this artificial intelligence data can do and can be used for, and a drive to innovation and a drive to pushing down the cost, where even if NVIDIA, if things go really, really wrong, where Alibaba releases something that completely disrupts the NVIDIA model, NVIDIA can protect itself by repurposing its data centers into mining Bitcoin and building a strategic reserve for NVIDIA, protecting the share price from the excessive shorting that would happen as a result of that. And potentially, if the Treasury wanted to, do a reverse merger of NVIDIA and MicroStrategy, then it could decide to, in a national security environment, print some dollars, crash the Fed, use proof of work, and protect itself in a black swan event, just like we covered with the Norwegian currency, the sovereign wealth funds, and all the other people. This is game theory to its fullest extent that we've always been covering in Bitcoin Hard Talk and helping you get ahead so you can front run all of the governments that are doing that, and you can individually separate yourself from state and money, because fortunately Bitcoin has proof of work, not proof of stake, because it didn't listen to the ESG narrative, and now everyone gets to repurpose electricity, support innovation in cheap infrastructure building, and use Bitcoin in order to make sure that even whoever owns it, it remains decentralized, and node operators back up the network, ensuring this beautiful, apolitical, geopolitically neutral tool in the currency war, and you get to front run it as the currency war gets worse and worse and worse. Anyway, artificial intelligence now is no longer a multi-billion-dollar expenditure that can only be done by Google, MicroStrategy, Meta with Facebook. And Trump came out and says DeepSeek, their advances should be a ginormous wake-up call for the United States, and challenge their tech companies to react, and react big time. The White House has decided to launch an investigation into the national security implications. The download in the App Store of DeepSeek completely outperformed OpenAI. And so more and more people were downloading it. And what a marketing strategy. Crash the US stock market. Everyone asks why the US stock market is crashing. And they say this new app got launched called DeepSeek. and it allows you, and it's open source, to do artificial intelligence cheaper. Everybody downloads. It's kind of like a TikTok type of environment. And the White House is going to be investigating the implication of China DeepSeek AI platform and whether it is a national security threat. Will this lead to a ban, which was what happened with TikTok when TikTok was used in order to perpetuate pro-Palestinian message, while Meta was being used in order to not allow any pro-Palestinian message and just pro-Israeli propaganda by the Israeli lobby. And TikTok was able to counter that. And then Telegram was used in order to get messages out from those that were suffering in war, to expose all of the things that were being hidden. And then that could be perpetuated through the social media networks that required a flip in the X strategy, where X decided you can have freedom of speech, but you can't have freedom of reach. So it said the messages I don't like, you can talk, but we'll use all that data for artificial intelligence, but we won't give you freedom of reach if you like the message. And so therefore we can decide you speak, but we'll oppress the messages that we don't want. And then Meta came out and said, we're going to do freedom of speech platform as well. And you get this whole flip as well. Will there be a ban of DeepSeek coming? Will it be like TikTok, where they force it to be acquired by the US government through executive order? We shall see. But in the meantime, Alibaba, they released an artificial intelligence platform that they claim is more powerful and surpasses DeepSeek in terms of its efficiency improvement. Basically, NVIDIA, it lost its $600 billion of cap because it had been doing massive compute expenditure. And this just is a capital expenditure side. I'm sure NVIDIA will react, and it can also have a Bitcoin strategy to perform, but there needs to be a valuation correction. And that's what we saw. It also killed the Microsoft charging for API calls on AI model, and kind of made that free. So Microsoft will have to adjust its model as a punishment for not voting yes to having Bitcoin on its balance sheet, because Bitcoin bounced immediately back from this and went up to the $105 mark, because it was just an irrational reaction, and you can't change the monetary policy of Bitcoin. So Microsoft could have hedged it and maybe Meta will now do that first, and we'll watch how this all plays out. So Seek, it killed the API model and charging for that, and made it, well, now everyone can run their own artificial intelligence on their own local environments. Are significantly cheaper. And we'll see what Alibaba comes up with next, and we'll see what the big 7 tech companies in the US comes up with next. And this will just be a drive and kind of a deflationary movement. There was a reaction from the Bitcoin miners that had hedged into AI, the public ones. Core Scientific was one of those. Hut 8 is another one of those. Riot, they were down approximately 18% with NVIDIA because they operate both Bitcoin mining operations and have contracts to provide data centers for those that are doing artificial intelligence. But it reiterates the importance that Bitcoin not only can be efficient for energy, it can also be efficient for hedging against these artificial intelligence wars as well. This will also have a massive impact on energy demand because this could drive people to looking back at solar and wind as cheap forms of electricity, because now artificial intelligence can be done at significantly cheaper. And maybe that will mean less consumption today and more investment in renewable energy as the free market plays. And the free market will do significantly more than these subsidized markets as we can start to see these energy plays go through as well. And that will determine, whether that will be disruption in the coal market again, because Trump's policy was drill, baby, drill. He wanted to get the price of oil down in order to weaken the Iranian and Russian economies and make it where basically China can buy those energy cheaper, and the American companies can then sell oil and gas to the European economy. But at the same time, that disrupts the profits of the US companies. And then it goes into tariffs, and we can have this massive unwinding of infrastructure and industry as we see this all roll out. So expect volatility to increase. I would say that it was very questionable around the timing of the release of the DeepSeek technology. Just happened to coincide with drill baby drill, tariffs, and the fact that America is really trying to negotiate a $600 billion investment into US to prop up the dollar, strengthen the dollar again, so that Saudi Arabia can prop up the petrodollar and do these tiered investments into America, and push forward with the Abraham Accords, which is what Trump wanted to do prior, and build those corridors between, like Qatar going through Saudi Arabia. They needed Syria. Syria has been, a move to a pro-US agenda because it's occupied by ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which are US and Israeli proxies. And so now you can drive that through a Turkey corridor and start exporting some of these gas pipelines through to Europe, which is why we had this expansion of NATO and an environment of investing more and more into the US military industrial complex to prop up the demand for dollar as well and destroy Europe at the, they're kind of the casualty for the propping up of the dollar. Anyway, Abraham Accords was being, that's the next negotiation. That requires Palestinian solution. And that's why in the geopolitical section, we're seeing all of this disruption where Israel is doing everything it can to prevent the Palestinian cause being resolved. And we'll go through more into that into the geopolitical section. But initially, Saudi Arabia is going to be looking to negotiate a deal to spend $600 billion. The initial is going to be $100 billion into military. And then the rest of it is going to be into artificial intelligence, data centers, and space exploration through the Saudi Arabian sovereign wealth funds as well. They also, as part of that deal, won F-35s fighter jets from America that requires artificial intelligence chips from Taiwan, that requires rare minerals and commodities from China. So the components of this protection of the US military industrial complex requires components that can only be made in China, while trying to negotiate a nuclear deal for Saudi Arabia, which requires a Palestinian cause solution. And then that comes into the Iran-Saudi Arabia, which is China's plan to make sure that they are going through a peace accord. But Israel doesn't want that to happen because they want Iran to make sure they're not got a nuclear deal with America, and only Saudi Arabia has that nuclear deal as well. And so it is tying all together. And so this was the timing of releasing the DeepSeek. And again, just like October the 7th allowed for Israel to achieve all of its military goals. And so even though the intelligence was ignored, and you had the Hannibal Directive, where Israel started killing its own people to make sure they weren't taken as hostages, and all of the propaganda campaign around the hoax that was happening on October the 7th to make everyone justify it. That was the very same thing that reversed the Abraham Accords. I think this DeepSeek thing is another thing. And so, this is a movement towards these macro trends as well. So what is the policy anyway? The macro policy is Trump said he wants to flood oil and gas and significantly lower the price of oil. He wants to work with Saudi Arabia to achieve it. And so that negotiation is a vital part of the strategy. Now, this is interesting as well, because OPEC, would like to keep oil prices high. Russia and Iran would like to keep oil prices high. Iran is part of OPEC as well. But Trump wants it to go down. Now, on average, this is not a science because sometimes oil is used for country interest, other times it's private company. But in general, OPEC could survive even if the price of oil went down to about $10. They wouldn't want to do that because that reduces their investments into their sovereign wealth and their investments into national security and supplying China with the resources that it needs as well. But the US sometimes can't go below $65 or $40 per barrel. So this completely kills US oil production. So this is like oil companies blowing up on itself because they won't be able to produce on that. So will that be done via subsidy, or is this a contraction of the oil industry dressed up as national security and a nationalist agenda? I can't pretend to understand the economics of all of these tariffs and the desire. So you have these deflationary tariffs. You have these deflationary, getting down the price of oil as part of negotiations. Maybe that's the whole thing. At the same time as inflationary Fed policy, inflationary replacing illegal immigration with legal immigration, inflationary, tariffs to get manufacturing domestic, and the cheapening of imports. I'm not sure if everything has been thought through, but more volatility is the answer anyway. I don't think that OPEC will comply in order to get the price of the barrel down to $40. So I think it's an empty threat, but it will likely destroy, if it happens, the US fracking and oil industry. I don't think Texas is going to be happy with $40 per barrel. Hence why maybe we're discussing Greenland, Canada, and the Panama Canal. So you can see this expansive national agenda, which leads into the implementation of the tariffs that are going to be happening this Saturday. Now, what is it with Panama? So Panama is able to, it's got this very profitable port that Trump wants to take over. It is currently profitable for Panama because it has a more geopolitically neutral. It works with America, it works with China, it works with BRICS, it works with the dollar. And so therefore it's got, profitable because it's allowed to have these routes. But if Trump wants to take it over and then use it just for US policy, this takes a port that generates approximately $1 billion of revenue profitably and makes it into loss making because it's being used as a geopolitical tool as well. So this may cost America, which means that it's an increase in the Federal Reserve's money printing, quantitative tightening, whatever it comes, in order to support the industry, in order to weaponize the port, to fight the trade war with China through tariffs, which is more disruption to Europe, more disruption to Canada, more disruption to Mexico, and it may take away all the profitability of the port because it has this geopolitical neutral environment. So get ready from this weekend: currency wars, tariffs wars, energy wars, and the European Union comes out and says, well, ECB, we know you're telling us not to buy Bitcoin, but sorry, we're considering purchasing Russian gas and repairing the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Do you think that's going to lead to tariffs between America and Europe because America wants it to buy all this gas? Buckle up. America is no longer working in the interest of its allies. This is going to have an impact on Canada, an impact on Greenland. And what are the Danish doing? Denmark is significantly increasing its protection of Greenland and started massively increasing its expenditure on the US military-industrial complex. Europe, more in the US military-industrial complex. More NATO threat, more in the US military-industrial complex. Expanding the deep state and the agenda of the Federal Reserve and completely ransoming the US economy as this US tariffs nationalist agenda is being portrayed, which most likely leads to a shrinking of the US economy is the only way I can see it. When that changes, I will look at it, and we shall see, which leads to these threats of 100% tariffs for anybody that tries to create competition to the dollar and use BRICS. Okay, officials, they came out and said that by buying Russian gas instead of American gas, it would reduce its high energy prices in Europe, and bring Russia into a closer negotiation to the table, which allows BlackRock to go into all of its collateral, and the UK to collect its IMF loans, and America to get its profits that came from the blood of all the Ukrainian people, which is why in 2014 this tariff war and this war against Russia all began. Europe first, what does it look like? It means ignoring the European Central Bank, its Fed first policy, as we covered in the first section. And it means, keep the EU, basically, the Fed's policy will keep it locked in submission. It needs to start thinking about its own countries and its own agenda as well. It needs to tackle the cost of living crisis. There is a rampant cost of living crisis across Europe, because it's, even when the inflation numbers come down, it's compounded inflation based upon previous priorities, and it needs to prioritize its people over the US military industrial complex and creating demand for the euro dollar. So ECB, stop being a pawn for the Fed, and European countries, build your own strategic Bitcoin reserves and start focusing on your own people, because the Fed certainly doesn't care about Europeans, and tariffs will follow, is what we're kind of seeing. Which brings us into the final section, the third section. That's all the macro I got for you. It kind of, the Bitcoin section kind of builds on macro, and macro now goes into the geopolitical side. So do me a favor, if you're enjoying this, like, retweet, share, hit the subscribe button. If you're watching a recording, put a comment. Let me know what you're thinking. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Please do that favor for me. If you haven't subscribed, hit the bell symbol. Hit the subscribe button, hit the bell symbol, hit all, and make sure that you take the time. Open up a browser, go to simondixon.com. And after this, you can sign up to the free Bitcoin Hard Talk membership portal, join my newsletter, and make sure you get all the resources you need to prepare for the transition to a Bitcoin AI and CBDC world. And we're going to jump into the geopolitics. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the European politics at the moment, and geopolitics, and how it affects by all these tariffs and everything. So the German parliament is currently in the midst of a debate about a potential plan against its what they call far right AFD ban. And this was propped up by Elon Musk, who runs some spaces with the AFD leaders. This is kind of, I think, the globalists fighting the nationalists. And this is what I think is a theme. So watch what's happening in Germany. It's deep in recession. It's going into its election cycle. You've got this globalist versus nationalist side. Elon Musk is engaging in political interference by propping up, using X in order to get his pro-Tesla first government in, which has a nationalist agenda. And quite rightly, a nationalist agenda should follow by a movement away from the ECB. So the globalists want the ECB, and you're getting this really battle of agenda with the civilians getting caught in the middle around, are we going to continue to use Europe for the power of the ECB, or are we going to ignore the ECB and go for a nationalist agenda? Elon Musk is dropping in that. And so we've got this internal politics between the ADF, which is essentially, and they're looking to ban that platform because Elon Musk platformed them. Essentially looking out for Tesla's interests. But at the same time, they've got good policies. And so while you may look at whether it's all of this nationalism that has a bit of a white kind of supremacy connotation, or is nationalism is in terms of building Bitcoin strategic reserves. I haven't really got opinion that. I don't know enough about the party, but they want to stop immigration, which is a global trend at the moment, to cartel that, replace that with legal immigration. They want to turn on their nuclear, which is in direct conflict with what the globalists wanted. The Fed and the deep state in America wanted to cut off all the gas from Russia and cut off the nuclear power plants. But Germany wants to turn on its nuclear power plants and stop buying gas from America. And so the ADF, the nationalists, would turn on its nuclear power. But the globalists, the deep state, is saying, no, you got to buy all of that from America and we're going to blow up the pipeline. So you watch out for these nationalism versus globalist versus deep state agendas coming through. Tesla's got the factory in Germany, which is supporting the manufacturing base and allowing to create jobs within America. But they want to, Tesla and Elon Musk wants to do, it's a visa program with India. And so India is now looking at, is it going to protect itself and build AI within India, or is it going to build it within America, or is it going to build it within Germany? And you have this competitive environment at the same time in direct conflict with a desire to look at immigration and support the demographic issues that are not being solved because birth rates are going down and down and down because people are suffering from inflation and more people are retiring in a pension life crisis that can only be solved with immigration by having taxes at the same time as the people wanting to go against immigration and the tariff wars and everything that's coming through. Try and put all this together. Everyone's looking at Trump to solve all the problems in the world. Everything has a side effect. And remember what was the fall of the British Empire. Everything just got too complex. They couldn't handle the colonies. Everyone started uprising. And the only way for that was to movement to decolonization, a shrinking of the British economy, and the takeover by the Bank of England to just use England as a vessel for the military-industrial complex, deep pharma, and the banking lobby, and the removal of all of its manufacturing base and having to export that to the global agenda that we're building the next proof of weapon network via the BRICS corridor as well, with no allegiance to any country. Anyway, will Germany fight against the ECB? Well, I think if it actually gets this nationalist side, I think that, yes, that could happen and they could build their own Bitcoin strategic reserves. And so there is a big campaign to kind of associate anything to do with that with Hitler and various other things. You've got these competing agendas that are happening. There's no democracy here. This is the large deep state deciding who's in charge of Germany, just how they did in England and France and Canada, and overthrowing them and just creating this left and right kind of democracy playground where we think things are going to actually change, when really distracting us from the real enemy, which is the central banking proof of weapons network and the deep state that it funds, which is really deciding who's in charge of these governments. Anyway, I doubt they will add any Bitcoin to their balance sheet, and any kind of radical, if this works. But if it moves to a nationalist agenda, that's more likely to get the Bitcoin on the balance sheet and stand up against the ECB. We will keep watching that as well. Okay, what else did we have this week? There was a strengthening in the enforcement. So Biden did a bunch of sanctions on Russia and Iran, which are just pretty much irrelevant. But Trump did an increase in the enforcement of those sanctions. Basically, they're not working. So there were these different oil tankers that weren't able to go through various ports, but they still made their way to China in the end. And while there is a bit of an increase in cost, oil is still being delivered and gas is still being delivered to China, despite the new sanctions being enforced. So it's not fulfilling the goal, which is why we're getting this movement towards tariffs creating more volatility and creating more and more focusing on their own interests, and the currency wars that are coming as well. I think what is happening here is that Trump may use Russian oil and gas, saying, okay, you get to repair Nord Stream pipeline, export some of it into Germany, and use that for leverage over making them ending the war with Ukraine, so that BlackRock can cash in on all of its land grab, and UK can save its economy through all the collateralized IMF debt as it leveraged up the UK pension system, through levering up to try and get higher returns by making sure that there was no peace with Ukraine, as Boris Johnson stopped all of the peace negotiations in order to try and save the UK pension crisis by levering up with all of those derivatives that were created by the UK banking lobby, at the expense of all the death and destruction that is happening by prolonging these negotiations. And now there's just no Ukrainian soldiers left. They've all gone. And, you're starting to get video from all of these Ukrainian soldiers that are just saying, can we just end this, please? Can we just negotiate? And they don't have any leverage, unfortunately. And so I think Trump is trying to get some leverage because the Biden chose the proof of weapons network, and the corrupt money and the military industrial complex and the lobby money. Anyway, remember, this didn't start in 2022. The US started this whole covert war through the CIA. This whole operation was started to end LNG exports from Russia to Europe. It started in 2014. There was a coup in Ukraine by the CIA in order to make sure that Ukraine didn't had a US, puppet, which ended up with Zelensky, and made sure that Russia didn't get their puppet, as it were. And then they got the NATO expansion, which was the aggravation. The blowing up of the Nord Stream pipeline, and the destruction of the European economy, in order to make sure that the CIA and the deep state won that, and all of these euro dollars ended up back in America. And basically the US, Germany, and UK military industrial complexes benefited by using NATO as a manipulative tool and the media in order to get the support they needed to spend all of this money in the US and create more wealth inequality and inflation in America, so that the hands of a few benefited at the expense of the middle class and the many. There were massive IMF loans to Ukraine. That's the economic hitmen. Look at the biggest recipients of aid and IMF loans. Who is it? It's Ukraine, in order to escalate this covert war. It's Egypt, in order to do the pro-Israeli policy. And it's Israel, in order to lock in the Palestinian cause so they can aggravate, tear up the nuclear deal that led to Iran having no choice but to escalate, because all of the negotiations had broken down. And then they were also sending aid and IMF loans to Lebanon. They crashed the Egyptian currency, they crashed the Lebanese currency, and they crashed the Ukrainian currency, and used this dollar debt that was collateralized by the British Empire and the Bank of England through IMF, and controlled those economies to install puppet regimes, as we're seeing in Lebanon right now, in order to prop up the dollar. And then at the end of that, you can get your pipelines built into Europe. It either comes from America, or they can get the Abraham Accords pipeline, which essentially says Qatar, one of the largest exporters of natural gas in the world. You have your pipeline through Saudi that comes up through Syria. Syria is now controlled by US proxy and Mossad proxy, ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And that can go through Israel. Everyone can charge a tariff as it goes through Turkey, and into the Mediterranean Sea and the pipeline. And we can just decide, Do we allow Russia to participate? Do we do it all through US, or do we do it through Israel, which is a US proxy, and what all of this was all about in the beginning, which is to exercise and prop up these covert deep state operations, and take out America's allies until the dollar no longer works and the globalist agenda goes into the next proof of weapon network, which may be BRICS, and they'll wait until it's useful. In reaction to that, the Russian Dmitry Medvedev, he came out and created a bit of a comment. It said, Donald Trump tried to mislead and confuse the entire world, but not us. We won't be fooled that easily. And so when he said the Ukrainian and Russian war will end within 24 hours, and now it's pivoted to 100 days as per the Kellogg plan, there was a bit of pushback because now, Trump came out and said all of these Russians are dying and there's millions of Russians, and trying to say that it's destroying the Russian economy when the Russian economy has strengthened. It's got down to a 22% debt to GDP, and it pushed forward the de-dollarization agenda when Russia would much rather have the neutral zone in Europe, work with Europe, and we can stop all these covert wars. So we will see. Trump inherits an absolute mess, but they're saying, Trump knew this because it started in 2014 and his 2016 campaign came through as well. Okay. In reaction, Trump has now officially suspended all aid to Ukraine as an executive order. I think that is actually in the execution phase. Biden wanted to get as much money through into the hands of the military-industrial complex, and the proof of weapons network printed as much money as it could in order to allow that. And Trump went in for the big one immediately. So he did a beta test of tariffs on Colombia, which was a victory, but he also followed it up with the big one, threatening tariffs on Taiwan and the chip makers, and basically saying that he's going to put crushing tariffs on Taiwan, which gets to the ginormous big one. Are we going to aggravate China into wanting to reunify with Taiwan through the trade war, or are we going to negotiate the status quo? And my hope is that Trump is just posturing, because it makes zero sense. The commodities come from China. The minerals come from China. The chips come from Taiwan. The artificial intelligence is coming from China and America. The Bitcoin mining is allowing people to opt out. The AI is requiring energy. It's a race to open source and a race to the bottom. And the tariffs is really a justification for what looks like the shrinking of the US economy in order to negotiate to prop up the dollar, which is supporting the Federal Reserve and the deep state, which is strengthening the movement against nationalism and going for the globalism and the transition to the next empire anyway. So it is a bit of a suicide mission. 80% of all the rare minerals come from China. And this is including what is needed for the military industrial complex and the manufacturing that left America and went over to the chips in Taiwan, because all of these F-35 fighter jets, these drones, because we're not going to have humans fighting wars, we're going to have drones fighting wars, and the artificial intelligence to make these decisions, that requires the semiconductor chips, and that requires working with China. So we'll see. It's good that leaders speak to each other is in a nutshell. Trump put out on the geopolitical side a beta test of how the tariffs was, and it was an epic victory. Let's face it. And so if it all goes this way, then Trump will be very happy. But he did a beta test on Colombia. So Trump basically decided to deport 2 planes full of Colombian deportees, and they landed in Colombia. And President Gustavo Petro Petro decided to refuse for these planes to land within Colombia, and he wanted them to be returned. And so Trump came back and said, you will let those planes land. And immediately, I'm going to request a 25% tariffs on Colombia. Colombia did a lot of posturing and announced that it will impose a 50% tariff upon America. And there was a whole long fight that went out on Truth Social and X and across social media with all the posturing saying that Colombia will not bow down to, this neo-colonialism that is being done by the US empire. And basically, after about 24 hours, whoever was telling or whoever controls Colombia, whether it be the deep state or the drug cartels or the ones that are negotiating, said, nah, these tariffs ain't happening. So basically, we've got to think about these connections as well. So you've got the Colombia side, and then you've got the Mexico side. So Mexico, actually, tomorrow, there will be the 25% tariff. Now, why Mexico? This is where the manufacturing is meant to happen. Well, what is the manufacturing? Remember, after the sanctions of China, China started hedging by building factories and moving its manufacturing to Mexico. And now Mexico is the largest partner. And so the tariffs of the 25% are a sub-tariff on China in order to push forward these negotiation and the Mexico sanctions. So that's what the beta test we're having next. So Colombia caved in and the tariff worked. It got the negotiation. But now we've got Mexico that starts tomorrow. And so we will see what happens there. But that really pushes towards the Taiwan-China side. And that's a lot bigger one. So we'll see the reaction. At the same time, remember that the collateralized debt through the IMF, collateralized by the Bank of England through the cost of living crisis on the UK people, which made up the financial products that are leveraged on the pension scheme to try and pay off the pensioners in UK pension crisis. The Keir Starmer came out and said, we're signing a 100-year security deal with Ukraine. I think this is about the UK being an outpost for the Fed first policy and the American first policy, so that basically UK can take over some of the BlackRock controlled land and build its military base there, a bit like the Bank of England through its covert war ended up with in Cyprus, where there's a massive UK military base in Cyprus. And then the country was split into three between the Ottomans, the Turkish side, the Greek side, the Cypriot side, and then you have the island being used for military. So basically, Ukraine is going to be part Russia, part BlackRock-controlled collateralized loans, part military for a negotiation with a UK outpost. How's that going to work in terms of the Cold War cessation agreements? And we're going to have, these military outposts as well, and a takeover of the natural gas and the wheat side, and basically America and Russia having full leverage over the future of Europe because the ECB is working for a Fed first policy. So hopefully we'll get some of these national Bitcoin strategic reserves. And hopefully we'll get that because the Fed's deep state is winning. is winning at the moment. We had an actual bill which was implemented by Trump to cut all foreign aid, which is included all the foreign aid. We're talking Ukraine, Egypt, Palestine, everything, but one exception to the complete banning of foreign aid, and no one talks about it. Israel, of course. So we had a lot of rhetoric that's going to help us decide what's going to be happening in the Middle East side with the Trump policy. Trump came out and he said during these executive orders that Gaza is a demolition site. He suggested that they should relocate all 2 million Palestinians in Gaza. Notice the number's gone down from 2.3 million to 2 million as more and more children are being found, as the genocide is being proven all along. But the Western media isn't covering it. But you're getting more and more numbers of people returning to their homes and finding their families in the rubble. More and more orphans with children being adopted as, this genocide was plastered up. But he said the 2 million, no longer 2.3 million, which is a number that probably is going down. The people from Gaza should go to Egypt, and the rest, i.e. from the West Bank, because the Israeli lobby allowed Trump to pay president, those 3.5 million people, they should go to Egypt. They should go to Jordan and said across Egypt. Egypt immediately came out and rejected that in order to prevent an uprising and a revolution against Sisi, which is the US implanted CIA operative from the Muslim Brotherhood uprising through the Arab Spring that led to Sisi being in charge so that America could bribe them through US aid in order to maintain that border through an Israel first policy to make sure that now that Hezbollah is no longer being funded to make that neutral environment, that you get the end of the Palestinian cause and the ethnic cleansing and genocide, which is being executed right now. Egypt, of course, had to come out and say, we reject any transfer of the Palestinians into its country, so that everyone can do the rhetoric and the fake war on terror 2.0 and say, see, no one wants these terrorists, which is, the media is used in order to make you feel that. Last Sunday, remember what I said on Friday? So the ceasefire agreement between Lebanon and Israel meant that the Israeli forces, the IDF, needed to leave Lebanon on Sunday. That was the ceasefire negotiation. Of course, the IDF said, no, Hezbollah has not fulfilled the agreement. We're not doing the ceasefire. We're going to continue occupying Lebanon, and violated the ceasefire agreement. So Israel is now committed to the Greater Israel project. And now Lebanon is saying you are breaking international law. But if it goes to United Nations, America will use its veto vote against the entire international community and say, hey, Trump says that Golan Heights is now Israel's, and he promised the Greater Israel project. And so now you can have a part of Lebanon. And you can also have a part of Syria as well, because Syria expanded, Israel went in, did 600 bombs during the US proxies, ISIS and Al Qaeda takeover with HTS, which is a Turkey NATO ally. During that whole reoccupation and the fall of the Assad, Israel took the opportunity to blow 600 bombs and occupy now vast quantities and larger quantities of Syria. So the Greater Israel project has been executed. The new regime in Syria is saying that they don't have the resources to come up against Israel. So Israel now has everything they need for the expanded strategic resources and resorts that it needs, with parts of Lebanon, parts of Syria, and a desire from Trump to either ethnically cleanse or genocide both Gaza and the West Bank, and put them into US puppet regime monarchy dictators, which were installed instead of democracy through CIA operations, Egypt and Jordan. And obviously they're going to say that we resist, we put up all the resistance because they don't want a revolution by the people that are pro-Palestinian as was the case in what happened when Iran was a revolution against the British and American installment of the Shah in order to use Iran's oil for British petroleum, US and UK interests as well. Anyway, suddenly it didn't really get any Western headlines, but the Lebanese ceasefire withdrawal is now extended to February the 18th. And of course, Israel said this is because Hezbollah didn't fulfill the agreement. Okay. The Israeli politics are getting pretty interesting right now. So if you've got to get above the headlines, so the ceasefire negotiation with Gaza is saying that in phase 2, there needs to be negotiations towards a Palestinian self-determination and a construct in phase 2 and 3 towards a Palestinian state. But remember, Israel is propped up by a coalition government. So Netanyahu, as soon as the ceasefire happened, he had to go in court and he had to start defending his corruption, which is why he wanted the war to continue. So he's got to try and get the war to continue so that he can then use the war to make sure that he doesn't get trialed for all the bribes and corruption and Epstein connections and political interference and criminal organizations that are used and done through the Israeli government. And all the assassinations and everything, connections to Mossad operations that are connected to 9/11, Epstein, all of this stuff. In order to make sure that that doesn't come to light, Smotrich, he had an extreme connection with the Messianic Israelis that believe that Palestine has to be completely eliminated. And Smotrich has said that if you get peace in phase 2, he said, I'm leaving the government, which will lead to the fall of the Israeli government. And then it will mean that you go into for the political corruption charges in phase 2. And so if that goes ahead, basically they are bribing and saying, you must go back to war. You cannot have peace. And so, if you end up putting, any of these, all of the Palestinians, they must be driven out. What they call Judea and Samaria, it must become Israel. So the Greater Israel Project is achieved. And so what Israel was meant to be doing is coming out of occupying the Egyptian border and the split between North Gaza and South Gaza, which is the Philadelphia corridor. And so they need to make sure that that doesn't happen. So once the hostage swap happens, they need to make sure that enough hostages are left behind, because intelligence obviously knows where they are, but they need to escalate the war again and make sure that phase 2 never gets to peace. And so Trump is driving a lot of that narrative, and we shall watch and happen. But we got the hostage swap that happened. So last week we got the 4 IDF soldiers. Now remember, they looked healthy. We were told that one of those was the one. Do you remember the infamous hoax video where it was used in order to show that the lady had blood all over her trousers and she was a citizen? Turns out she was an IDF soldier, so she's a prisoner of war, not a hostage. I'm not saying this is good. I wish none of this happened, but this is where we are. And then the footage came out later showing that the blood on her trousers was not any of the sexual violence. It was actually, the video came out showing that her hands were tied back and there was blood coming out of her hand onto her trouser. And then they used that in order to use the hoax of saying that there were mass beheaded babies and systemic, sexual attacks and stuff. Well, she was one of the ones that came out, and 4 of them were all very happy. They'd all kind of put on some weight, obviously you can stage all this types of propaganda, but immediately they were told they can't speak to the press, because remember way back in 2023 when the first hostage swap happened, the elderly lady came out and blamed Netanyahu for October the 7th for the IDF opening fire and killing their own people that they said was just the Hamas people. But they made sure that none of that happened. And they were exchanged for the 200 Palestinians, and the Palestinians looked like completely tortured, completely, looked like they had put on 100 years or something for them. And so I think we're getting there was the announcement of the next 3 Israeli hostages. So these are civilians this time, 3 men. And I think that leads to 70 of the Palestinian hostages being released. And so at the same time, last week, Israel broke the ceasefire negotiations. So they said, the people that you're going to release this Friday, we want them earlier. And they shot 2 Palestinians that were returning home when you saw these massive exodus of people coming from Rafah to the north to try and find their family that are just buried in all the rubble at the moment. And so that was a breach of ceasefire, but that didn't make any of the Western media. One of the hostages that came out from the Palestinian side, from the Israeli prisons, he'd been in there for 40 years. And he wasn't allowed to go home. They sent him to Egypt and basically, is not allowed to reunify with his family so that they can be rearrested if they want as well. As I said, Israel decided to prevent all from returning up north, but those eventually reopened as the negotiation, but they killed 2 Palestinians in Gaza during the ceasefire in violation of those agreements as well. So anyway, this Friday, tomorrow, and I love seeing, the Israeli hostages return to their family. Of course, I like that. But you can really see how the bloody, make sure you watch the documentary on my blog, Atrocity Inc., that revealed the complicity in the media in the hoax in weaponizing, the Jewish faith and the Western Christians and the Muslims in order to create this violent environment by weaponizing media and propaganda to create this environment and justification for war. So 3 Israelis will be swapped. I think that we may get another 200 Palestinians, or maybe it's a little bit less, but we will see as well. EU decided to step in, interestingly, and say they want to enforce the Philadelphia corridor, and they want to enforce that Israel gets out. So the Trump American agenda, again, is in violation of the EU agenda here. EU is saying we want to get back to trading with BRICS and buying from Russia. We want to resolve the America First war that happened through the NATO expansion. And we want to ensure that Israel actually retreats from Gaza and Egypt. And so EU is now getting involved and saying we want to make sure that happens. But Trump is saying, no, the Palestinians need to go to Egypt and Jordan. So again, we get another conflict here between between EU trying to save its economy and get back on track versus America trying to save its economy through, perpetuating the military-industrial complex. EU is also wanted to they want to ease the sanctions in Syria and allow Syria to get back to trade, because at the moment, the US occupies all the oil and is using it for deep state slush fund, selling the oil, using the Kurds, which is a communist regime, in order to protect it, funding, the protection of the oil and making sure that the wheat can't be used by Syria, just as the wheat can't be used in Ukraine, in order to create all of those food market carnage and oil market disruption. The EU wanted to ease the sanctions in Syria on both the banks, the energy, and the transport. But Trump is keeping those sanctions and enforcing that through the Kurds, because, so again, this might be another. Does EU and the ECB win for the Fed First strategy, or does Europe favor its own people build Bitcoin strategic reserves and go against the Fed first policy and against the ECB. But this is another example of those geopolitical situations as well. In violation of the International Criminal Court, the highest law, the International Criminal Justice Court, which has said that Israel has committed plausible genocide and that Netanyahu and various other Smotrich Gavir have committed crimes against humanity, and they must be arrested if they enter into any country that wants to abide by international law. In violation of that, Trump will be meeting Israel's Prime Minister Netanyahu and basically the shadow president of the US Congress and lobby bribes, as you saw during the last visit. And he won't be arresting him. And he has eased all of the sanctions on the illegal Israeli settlers that are committing terrorism by burning down Palestinians' houses in the West Bank. Despite the arrest warrant, basically Netanyahu will be visiting President Trump, and they have said, international law over, Geneva Convention over, United Nations, it can only be used against other people, but it can't be used against America or our allies. And so, surprise, surprise, this is going to be the last part of the section. We did get the release of the JFK files, and probably going to be blaming CIA and not blaming Mossad, for all the reasons that we've covered in previous. But there was a massive promise missing from the executive order that we haven't seen. Trump decided against releasing the Epstein client list because we know it's a Mossad operation, and we also had no release of the 9/11 files because we don't want to list the names of the Mossad operatives that were sent by Israel to document the fall, and the dancing Israelis that documented it, and the vans that were arrested through urban movers that were putting in the what was needed for the controlled demolitions, and the documentation of what later led to the Mossad CIA deep state operation of the clean break theory that led to the atrocities of the Iraqi war, that was later WikiLeaks was used, where Bitcoin saved it, and the crimes against humanity that happened in Iraq, and all of the email leaks that confirmed by the Hillary Clinton email leaks that confirmed that ISIS is a Mossad operation, and that Al-Qaeda is actually a deep state CIA operation, through all the email leaks that then Trump used in order to say crooked Hillary Clinton, and they came back with the Russia, 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 and we get all of this weaponization of WikiLeaks. And that is why, in the end, Bitcoin is the lifeboat. And so every individual can use Bitcoin in order to protect himself and front run the geopolitics and the macro environment. Every company can build Bitcoin treasuries in order to protect itself from NVIDIA crashes, use of deep state or DeepSeek AI that can then use Bitcoin mining in order to build those strategic reserves to protect themselves from the short sellers. Every private company can build Bitcoin treasuries in order to protect themselves from the inflation of the Federal Reserve and the deep state. Every country can decide to protect itself from its central bank by building Bitcoin strategic reserves. Every central bank can try and preserve its occupation of the countries by building Bitcoin strategic reserves. And, it's up to you, but Bitcoin is really playing at the highest level right now. And there are some people that are saying, I ain't buying it because quantum computer may take it down. If you're using that as a reason I released many videos that will help you understand that. Join me on X Spaces, and I'll make you understand what Bitcoin is doing to protect against all these things as well. Anyway. And so, sorry for the disaster. We'll edit out the disaster in between. If you were watching on X, hopefully you forwarded out through the disaster. But always remember, you are alive at one of the most interesting and exciting times in financial history. Many are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do incredibly well. And I want to make sure you're on the right side of that change. And we do that with peace, love, and unity through Bitcoin. Make sure you sign up to simondixon.com. Follow me on X. Like, subscribe, share, get as many people prepared for a Bitcoin, AI, and CBDC world. Please do share. Please do comments. I read your comments. I will reply to them. And I use that in order to make sure that the content's good and covering what is happening this week. It's getting longer and longer because so much is happening each week. The news cycle is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, but always follow the money. I hope this is useful for you. Please help me share my message. Join me on simondixon.com. That's going to be everything for Bitcoin Hard Talk, episode 68, on why Europe needs to ditch the ECB and use their Bitcoin strategic reserves to protect themselves from the ECB's Fed first policy, and do it with peace. I'll see you next week. Bitcoin Hard Talk episode 69. Comment below, subscribe, share.